Right.
But I do think that there is, I think where Caldwell, where Caldwell is right is that I think that, there was just to my mind, a massive underestimation of the kind of potential cultural gulf. And I think the cultural gulf has been widened by the experience of immigration, where you have sort of the experience of being an isolated population in a, decaying Parisian suburb actually leads people to become more sort of radically, zealously Islamic or Islamist than they would have been in their home countries. And there's a large underestimation just of how hard. I mean, if you look at the American experience with Hispanic immigration, right? Whatever your views on Hispanic immigration, it's clear that, even with a population that has historic ties to the United States, that shares a religion that's, one of the major religions of the United States, Roman Catholicism, and that's lived next door to the U.S. for generations, you still have huge assimilation problems. And
right.
I think that, all of those problems are compounded by the fact that, in the case of Europe, you're dealing with a population that is, I think you can clearly oversell, and many people on the right do, the kind of, clash of civilizations element, but there is a clash of civilizations element. I mean,
sure.
Europe,
well,
and you see this most explicitly in the debates about admitting Turkey to the EU, but more broadly, Islam and the Islamic Mediterranean and Christian Europe had been engaged in a sort of cold, hot war for all of history.
Yeah, I mean, it's
since
I would not.
Since, yeah.
I would not go nearly that far, but obviously it's substantial cultural difference. And I think probably the better comparison, and a comparison that ultimately leaves me feeling optimistic, is not to the current immigration to the United States, but to the pre-World War I immigration to the United States, when Catholics from Southern and Eastern Europe were, at that time, really were perceived as belonging to a very alien religious and cultural paradigm of Catholicism. Were also, I mean, it's funny if you look at cartoons and stuff from them. I mean, the perception among, sort of mainstream Northern European-derived Americans was that there were these, extremely large, visibly obvious physical differences between sort of native stock Americans and Italians and Slavs, things like that. And at the same time, you also had, it's been completely forgotten in contemporary life because it turned out not to be relevant. But there was this enormous wave of terrorist violence associated with the anarchist political movement, mostly emanating from the Catholic South and East of Europe, that for a while, until World War I and the Bolshevik Revolution, appeared to be this huge security problem. They were killing presidents
right.
and kings, they were blowing stuff up, there was enormous, civil liberties crackdowns, there were liberals who were, outraged by the treatment of people.
Right.
Everyone was freaking out. And I kind of think, this is probably a subject for another day's Blogging Heads, but that Al Qaeda is gonna kind of go down as the anarchists of our time, and this political violence that you see some of in Europe associated with alienated Muslim communities is very scary to people. As of course, it would be, but I think there's a tendency to see it as like the harbinger of bigger and much worse kind of violent conflict, when it should be seen as a frightening. It's good that people are concerned about
right.
it.
It's frightening
better
enough
than just being complacent. But I think people sometimes read, rather than saying, well, what's happening now is bad and we need to turn it around, people say what's happening now is bad and something like 2 orders of magnitude worse is right around the corner, which
right. There are two. I think the reasons to worry that something worse is around the corner are, well, maybe twofold. Maybe there are more. One is that one of the reasons the problems you're describing in American immigration went away to some extent was that America stopped immigration dead
right.
in the 1920s with a frankly pretty racist set of policies, and America was able to, because we were separated by an ocean from Europe, was able to basically enforce a very strict no immigration policy for the next 35 years, 45. It was 20s to the late 60s. So. And during that period, you had, essentially you just sort of took a pause and said, all right, we've got this population here, and we're going to assimilate them rigorously. All right, so it's threefold, right? So it's one, you had a pause. Then you have an economy that is, in hindsight, I think, looks ideally geared towards the assimilation of low-skilled immigrants. You had an industrial economy run by kind of feudal barons who would, set up, English language schools in their factories because they wanted workers who could speak English and so on. I mean, and it was, again, it was oppressive in many ways, but it was oppressive in ways that worked to further assimilation. So those two things seem to be at least somewhat absent in Europe. I mean, you have immigration is not going on at the rates that was going on when you had huge guest worker programs, obviously in the 50s and 60s. But Europe, shares land mainly sea borders with these regions in ways that
Although I mean the actual volume of European immigration, even when it was high,
was not
much lower than in America at its high ebb, and now it's down.
Right. But still, you are.
But yes,
are
I mean you're not
going to
see that clean break.
These workers came when they came. There was an assumption that they were coming to fill holes in an industrial economy. They were coming, because of labor shortages, and that industrial economy really doesn't exist to the same extent, and you don't have. And at the same time, the other factor I think that worries people is just that the level of violence, the level of violence that's available to would-be terrorists is a lot more than throwing a bomb into a car that contains a couple of politicians, and that's I think where. To my mind, I basically assume that, this is a problem. It's a big problem, but it will be a manageable problem for Europe over the next 50 years. However, you can imagine in ways I think you couldn't in 1909, levels of escalation happening where, you have massive bombings, for instance, in European cities that set off a kind of, a sort of cycle of escalating tension that goes in really dark directions. Maybe.